I'm Nicola Tallant, and you're listening to Crime World, a podcast about criminals, drugs, and the sins of the underworld. We're Ireland's top podcast for 2025, and now we've got a new website. So if you want to learn more about crime and criminals, if you want stories, extras, and podcast subscriber specials, go to www.crimeworld.com. So anybody really who faces court, pleads not guilty, goes through a trial and ends up either with the mandatory life sentence for murder or very long sentences for, in this case, false imprisonment and intentionally causing harm to Kevin Lunney, you will see appeals. They kind of come naturally. So their lawyers will look for areas that they can either look to overturn the convictions or challenge the length of the sentences. Now, Alan Harte from Island Quay Apartments, he's 44. Alan O'Brien, 44, he was from East Wall. And Darren Redmond, who was 31, from Caledon Road in East Wall. Actually, all three were from East Wall, Island Quay Apartments. They were all found guilty and they were sentenced to Harte, 30 years, O'Brien, 25 years, and Redmond, 18 years. Their first kind of tranche of appeal has failed because they've gone to the Court of Appeal and they have put up some arguments to state that the convictions should be overturned, that they were, that a wrong decision was made, essentially.
Yeah, so people will remember the case. I think it's one of the most... it's people aren't going to forget it. I mean, Kevin Lunney, who was a director in one of the companies that had formerly been owned by Sean Quinn, was abducted, falsely imprisoned in a container near his home, and then he was tortured effectively. He was stripped naked, bleach was thrown over his body. He suffered assaults and had QH carved into his chest. I mean, about as extreme a crime as this country has seen in recent times.
And now, something that followed a huge amount of unrest in Cavan.
Yes.
And was all focused on the background of Sean Quinn, who had been the richest man in the country, who had been somebody who had sort of overstretched itself in the boom times. And the business was basically, he lost the business after the crash.
Yeah.
Because he had borrowed too heavily. He couldn't pay back those loans. And many would say that the rest of us have been sort of paying for his mistakes ever since.
Yeah, now he would say something different.
He does, of course, say something different, but that was the case. So Quinn Industrial Holdings and Quinn's empire was built over a mountain in Cavan, and he had started this business basically with the rumour had it, with a shovel himself, and had been, out. The mountain is quite extraordinary what's on it. There's concrete companies, there's glass factories, there's windmills. Quinn's empire was enormous, and he was a very powerful individual within the community. In the aftermath of him being removed from his own company, there was all sorts of shenanigans. He was brought back in as a consultant, rows happened, etc. But at a particular point in time, as things were pretty dirty, there was firebomb attacks on the businesses he once owned. There was all sorts of things happening in the mountain as regards stuff was going into the glass factory that was ruining the production of the glass and costing money to the companies that were making it. There was, tires being burst on very big vehicles. There was at one point into the Quinn Insurance Company, a truck was driven in through the gates. It was all this sort of intimidation going on in the background.
Yes, and most of it was directed by a guy called Dublin Jimmy, who we spoke about recently on the podcast in connection with one of his associates going down. So Cyril McGuinness was his real name. Dublin Jimmy was what he was known as. No surprise, he was from Dublin, from Swords. And Cyril McGuinness was an unusual type of gang boss, but a gang boss he was, who had been involved in, I suppose, associated with the Provisional IRA, certainly not an IRA member, but had been involved in some of their smuggling operations. He'd moved up around the border area and had been involved in crimes across Europe. Some of them...
Spent time in a Russian gulag.
Had been prosecuted in Belgium, wasn't it, for
kind of
selling
theft of industrial machinery. And
yes, and a lot of that type of crime, also been involved in cattle rustling and a lot of that sort of border smuggling crime that, you know, he'd become a very wealthy man. So as you spoke about, as this long-running saga went on, Dublin Jimmy was hired basically to carry out a campaign of intimidation for the people involved in the takeover of the Quinn businesses.
I suppose to sort of explain, after they all went into receivership, the receivers were then selling them on. I think a Spanish company came in and bought the glass factory. Some of the previous directors, along with Quinn, one of whom had been Kevin Lunney, were placed back in positions in some of the companies that they were trying to buy it out themselves between a number of directors, and Quinn was always in the background. Quinn's always wanted to claw back his empire.
Yes, and of course he did have support from the local community because Sean Quinn had become Ireland's richest man, as you said, but he hadn't moved to the south of Dublin and you know, invested all his money in you know, abroad or anything. He'd kept all his businesses in the local area, so there was support for him. And one way or another, Dublin Jimmy, who presumably didn't care too much either way, became involved in this very, very extreme campaign of intimidation. Some of it as small as just blocking roads off when trucks were coming back and forth, but also, as you described, some extreme violence. So, after Kevin Lunney was kidnapped and he was rescued by the guards, the instant suspicion would have fallen on Dublin Jimmy. Now, Alan Harte, Alan O'Brien and Darren Redmond, none of them obviously were living up in that border area. But the belief is, and remains the belief, that Dublin Jimmy had come in contact with one of these guys. It is believed, I suppose, that to be Alan Harte while serving a prison sentence or through associates, but through the prison.
Funny, years ago when I was looking into Dublin Jimmy, I remember there was one business he had and the address of it was in Eastwall, where all these men are from. And we went to see the house. It was supposed to be a business address, but it was just a rundown, empty property.
Yeah.
We clearly had links to that area where these three men had been living.
And he had, they were believed to have been hired in. They had no particular connection with the area, but that their connection with Dublin Jimmy had been brought in. Now, Alan Harte was, you know, he actually wasn't named during the trial because at that point he was due to go on trial for the death of his friend. Now, ultimately that case was dropped. But Alan Harte is a particularly violent and dangerous criminal. I think he has over 180 convictions. You know,
he was the one, he got the 30 years. He was really found to have inflicted most of the injuries on Lunney during the attack.
Yes, and a very, very dangerous criminal even before this incident. Now, ultimately, he served a conviction in relation to helping to dispose of the murdered body of his friend Peter Gunn. The other charges in relation to the death of Peter Gunn were dropped, and so he was subsequently named. He went on trial at one point accused of murdering Gunn, and it was said that he had been drinking with Gunn and a third man, and then ultimately Peter Gunn had been stabbed to death, and then there was a dispute between Alan Harte and the other man, both of whom sort of effectively blamed each other. So Alan Harte was, a very, very dangerous, violent criminal who had been involved in all sorts of criminality, and that, it's believed he was brought up and did this. So this week we heard this appeal, and the appeal centres around a number of issues. So at one point there was DNA was taken from a van, and this van was believed to have Kevin Lunney was not suspected of being in the van, but the three men were believed to have been travelling in this van. Now they got some DNA samples off this van. I think of Kevin Lunney. The state's case was that the DNA had come from those men abducting Kevin Lunney, and then they transplanted that that DNA onto the van. Now the van was, tests were done, and the van was taken into police custody, but there had been a fire at the station, and the van had been destroyed. So that was one of the grounds on which
the
they
lawyer
appealed
said
it.
that evidence, that DNA evidence, should never have been before the court because it couldn't have been essentially checked in the aftermath or inspected by defence experts because the van was destroyed by the time they were taking the case for their clients.
Then there was the other ground that was rejected by the Special Criminal Court. The other grounds, I suppose, are kind of standard grounds for the appeals. One of them was in relation to the use of phone evidence, and the phone evidence, it was actually a really, really long case, and the phone evidence was quite central. And I won't get into burner phones bouncing off cell towers and all of that because I don't remember it fully to understand it. But that was very key evidence. And
well, they were arguing that it was an invasion of their privacy that the phone records were used in the trial.
Yes, and some of this centred around the case brought in by Graham Dwyer, actually, to the European Court of Human Rights. But again, that was rejected by the appeals court. And then there was a further grounds in relation to CCTV, which again is a sort of a standard ground that the CCTV shouldn't have been used
for their privacy.
Yeah, and exactly.
Privacy,
yeah.
That's always one. Anyway, one way or another, the judgment has been delivered, and they have been told that these convictions are not going to be overturned. So the lawyers for the three have now said that they plan to go ahead with appeals against the sort of the respective sentences, the severity of those sentences. And they've asked the court to list the matter again for case management. So that will happen. The first listing will be before the courts in February, and no doubt they will be arguing that those sentences are too hefty in relation to the crime.
And they are lengthy sentences, but I mean, the crime is a particularly barbaric crime. But certainly, if you look at the types of lengthy sentences you receive in an Irish court, sort of tiger kidnappings, false imprisonments, any sort of thing involving torture, 30 years is particularly long, but it's not maybe out of kilter with some of the other very, very lengthy sentences you see for equivalent crimes, which absolutely are almost always well over a decade.
And Lunney, I know you went through what happened, and obviously he was stripped to his boxer shorts. He had his leg broken. He was doused in bleach, beaten with a wooden bat on the ground. His face was cut, and those letters, Quinn, QIH, Quinn Industrial Holdings, were scored onto his chest with a Stanley knife. But he was also dumped then, frozen, bloodied, beating on a country road, and he had to crawl to get help. He actually was discovered ultimately by a man driving a tractor. And I think it was made clear during that time that not only could he have probably died during the attack, but he could have died the way he was sort of discarded on the side of the road with the injuries he had. He had a broken leg.
Yeah.
He couldn't obviously run or walk for help. He was dragging the leg behind him on the ground, and it was savage.
I mean, it was savage if you consider that these people were hirelings who had no skin in the game. I don't know what they're...
Dublin Jimmy, of course, subsequently went to the UK, and during his arrest took a massive cardiac and died as the police arrived to raid and to search the property that he was living in.
Yeah, he was living in, was it Derby or Nottingham or somewhere around there, and it was actually this crime is what they were investigating. That the guards have been in touch with the UK police.
So he had a very dramatic end to his career and to his engagement with this case, because he didn't live to stand trial for anything.
No, and of course then whoever had hired him, and who that's been referred to as the paymaster routinely now in the news media, that kind of, maybe that investigation to a degree at least, and I'm sure the guards continued to look into it, but it probably dies with Dublin Jimmy because, you know, he's gone. And I suppose that would have been the guards' preference, would have been to bring him in, arrest him, you know, and see if they can, you know, move that on from there. But of course, so while these three guys and their crime is horrific, there is a couple of people who escaped justice one way or another, as of this moment anyway.
And I'm sure Kevin Lunney is very happy that those guys didn't have their convictions overturned, because they would have walked free from prison, had they? Okay, Niall, thank you.
Thanks.